and he'll be talking a little bit about boardsmanship and micromanagement, or avoiding micromanagement. Kind of like when we talked about the sexual harassment training.
Well, obviously, we've been wearing you out. The questions are going down and down and down. That's good news. Actually, we're about on time again. That's good. Okay. Is it working? Well, the good news about my presentation is I'm not going to give you a bunch of legal mumbo jumbo like the rest of the presenters here. Most of the items I'm discussing really, they have to do with common sense and being on a team. Most people who are on boards, let's face it, you're not out there putting your name out there to be on a board in some quest to seize power over something. You know, it's frankly, a lot of boards, it's a very thankless job. And most people do that have civic responsibility, or they care about a particular item that has been provided to the public, or a service, and how it's being provided, so they get on board. Citizen oversight of local government. Some people think it's the cornerstone of democracy in the United States. The role of board members, especially on boards in local special districts, is to ensure that the districts are run in a responsible manner that reflect the values of the people that they're serving. Boards fulfill this role by performing 5 major responsibilities. Let's see if I can get them up here. Responsibilities of the board are setting direction, establishing an effective and efficient structure, providing support, ensuring accountability, and providing community leadership. And we're going to talk about what those 5 things mean. These 5 responsibilities represent the core functions and the fundamentals to a special district's accountability to the public. The authority is granted to the board as a whole, not to each individual board member to act as they please individuals. Therefore, board members fulfill these responsibilities by working together as a governance team and to make decisions that will be in the best interest of their community. How do you set direction? Well, of all the roles and responsibilities of governing board, none is more important than setting the direction. The central purpose of a board, or a special district governance, rather, is ensuring that a long-term vision is established for your district. The vision should reflect the consensus of the community, the board, and the district staff as to what is needed for the district to provide the services needed by your community. The vision should set a direction for the district, driving every aspect of the district's programs. The second point is establishing an effective and efficient structure. Now, you as board members, your responsibility is for establishing and maintaining an organizational structure that supports the district's vision and empowers the staff. That's the only way you're going to go down that road that you guys have set. Board members are responsible for overseeing the development and adoption of policies, establishing budget priorities, adopting the budget, and overseeing facilities issues. The third prong would be providing support. What does that mean? It means just what it says, work as a team. A board functions only through teamwork. The team must come together to achieve the goals of the district. Board members must always remember they are part of a team. An individual board member has no authority to act on his or her own. One of the most basic tenets of effective boardsmanship is the recognition that the governing authority rests with the entire board and not with any individual member. As individuals, board members have no authority to direct staff, determine programs and procedures, or represent the district, and ethical trustees try not to do so. Otherwise, they end up with that red face. Ensuring accountability. As community representatives, boards are accountable to the public for the performance of the special district. Boards establish systems and processes to monitor results, evaluate the progress towards accomplishing the district's vision, and communicate that progress to the local community. In order to ensure personnel, program, and fiscal accountability, boards are responsible for evaluating and setting policies for the district, monitoring, reviewing, and revising policies, serving as a quasi-judicial body when needed, monitoring achievement and program effectiveness and making changes as indicated, preparing and adjusting budgets, and responding to public concerns. Board members also meet to act as community leaders. Board members have a responsibility to involve the community in meaningful ways in setting the direction for the district. The board must communicate clearly about district policies, programs, and fiscal conditions, and progress on goals adopted to achieve the board's vision. By working together in ways that reflect these standards, board members on an effective board will better serve their communities. Now, if any of you are on utility district boards, you probably know that the community never seems to want to be involved on a regular basis. My observation has been at my small utility I represent is that mostly we have one employee show up most weeks. Every once in a while we have one community member, but as soon as you start talking about a Prop 218 rate increase or something like that, then suddenly people are interested. They'll pay $60 or $70 for cable every month. If you don't actually pay $23 for water, then you have torches and pitchforks. So it's really important to generate some means of getting some outreach or getting the word out about what you're doing and what things really cost to your district. So people aren't taken by surprise, even though if they were coming to the meetings, they would know what's going on. And so community outreach is really an important thing in acting as a community leader so that the entire community is on the same wavelength and they know where they're going. Boardmanship, an individual and team effort. What does that mean? Part of course, being part of a team is appropriate participation in meetings. It may seem simple, but one of the, people are busy and they get on boards and their situations may change sometimes and they realize they have to be somewhere or they're in a time crunch. And it's very difficult for some people to be on time for the meetings or to stay for the entire meeting. However, once you're on a board, that's the responsibility you've determined you're going to do. And I would recommend if you can't make the meetings or you can't stay for them, to work on finding a replacement as a board member. Obviously, board members should follow all the rules of the Brown Act. Beyond that, rules for meetings are governed by board bylaws and policies. As was discussed earlier, I think by Mr. Farley, Robert's Rules of Order can be helpful, but many special districts generally have different quorum and voting requirements. Because of quorum and minimum voting requirements, it's important for board members to be on time to board meetings, because obviously your vote may be needed, or if someone wants to do something with the agenda that requires more than a quorum, they're going to need you to be there. So you should be on time, you should actively participate, vote your position, and abstain only when necessary due to a conflict of interest or other legitimate reason. Board members shouldn't leave early, as we discussed. Board members should practice civility in their discussion of board issues. And I know all you guys do this, right? There's never a heated debate. Board members should study the issues carefully and prepare for meetings by reviewing the agenda and attachments prior to the board meeting. Board meetings should feel free to discuss problems, issues, and concerns as forcefully as they wish, but always weighing the pros and cons, and to do so in a manner that does not attack people individually. Board members should be open to ideas and should not criticize them immediately or to the people advancing them. Board members need to remember that just because they think their own ideas are the best, not everyone may agree. And in fact, another solution might even be better. Board members therefore need to be open to other people's ideas and suggestions, and to listen and make informed decisions. What's the role of an individual on a board? You have to remember you're on a team. So, you need to represent the common good. Boardsmanship, as I said earlier, is really an expression of civic leadership and citizenship. because, as I said, often it's a thankless job. This means a board member should make decisions based on the overall best interest as a whole for the district and the people you're serving. The board member should, in particular, avoid a bias for a particular geographic area or the demands of special interest groups or political expediency in your district. And once the board makes a collective decision, and this is the hardest thing to do, even if an individual board member voted against it, it becomes the duty of every board member to abide by and uphold the adopted position of the board. You should make decisions with good judgment and with sufficient study and knowledge. Making ethical decisions means applying your core values to decision making. However, making good decisions also means seeking and considering all available facts and perspectives. It means studying and asking questions to clarify board agenda materials. Being ethical and responsible to the public means not making any promise about how you will vote prior to discussion in open meetings. Maintain confidentiality for non-public matters. Now, I think it was Mr. Farley who also discussed this. While most of what the board does is public, an important aspect of boardsmanship, ethics at least, is maintaining confidentiality about issues discussed in closed session. Violating confidentiality occurs when individuals share closed session information, such as leaking information to the media or discussing private information. Most importantly, avoid getting a reputation as a rogue board member. It's entirely appropriate for board members to exercise their individual judgment and point of view. But the best decisions are made with the collective wisdom, considering input from everyone. And board members should not rely on any one single source or constituency or narrow philosophies for their personal approach to being a board member. Instead, the board members learn all they can about competing viewpoints and then hopefully find a way to build some consensus. But once a decision is made, a good board member upholds that decision. Board ethics. I think last year there may have been a discussion about board ethics, and Kathleen mentioned it in terms of the 1090 violations and things like that. But I'm just going to touch on it very generally. Ethics are more than the absolute minimum standards that you should be shooting for. The law oftentimes identifies minimum standards. Board members should strive not for merely minimal standard compliance to the law, but rather for best practices for meeting the highest standards. So the law is the minimum standards, what you're shooting for in your ethics are the highest standards. Let's talk about universal ethical values. Trustworthiness, loyalty, responsibility, respect, fairness, and compassion. I just love the person who put this particular slide together, put a puppy dog in it. Isn't that great? Many public entities actually adopt a code of ethics. And they find it helpful to adopt not really standards of professional conduct for its employees, but some kind of code of ethics for the board itself. Do any of your district's boards have codes of ethics? Do you have one? It's interesting if you get online and just Google code of ethics. In California, you'll come up with dozens of models of codes of ethics for boards if you ever need one. And it seems to me that most of them have distilled down that they're very similar. They talk about don't have a special interest in something you're voting on, or disclose that interest. They kind of mirror the law, but they have you go further into areas that aren't necessarily a violation of the law, but they want their boards to maintain the highest standards. Most of you as board members at some point had ethics training, correct? You know the requirements usually? They're AB 1, 2, 3, 4, I think is what it's called. Most people are required within a year of taking office to have ethics training, and then thereafter it's every 2 years. The legislature requires special district board members to attend mandatory ethics classes. This training sometimes appears to be tedious and may appear that way and somewhat of a hassle, but it's important. So you need to review the material and take it to heart because it is important. There's actually free interactive online training on the Fair Political Practices website. Oh, here it is. Within the first year and at least once every 2 years after that. There it is, available free online. It doesn't give you the website. I'm going to tell you the website. It's just fppc.ca.gov. And that's
the reference at the very back.
okay.
The reference list tab. The FAPC.
So that's the only law I'm going to throw in. And if you go onto their website, they actually have a link to their ethics. And you can follow the links to a free AB1234 ethics training for local officials site, or you can go straight to the training site. And that might be in the back too, the local ethics.fppc.gov. And that course covers not only the basics of the Brown Act and conflicts of interest, but other aspects of the Political Reform Act, such as the limits and reporting requirements on received gifts and honoraria, and other laws such as incompatible offices, misuse of public funds, and the prohibition against mass mailings and gifts of public funds. It talks about reimbursements for expenses incurred in the course of serving the district and more. Many of the laws promoting transparency in government, fair and impartial decision-making touch on these ethical responsibilities. For example, the bidding requirements for contracts may seem like just a business issue, but their ultimate purpose is to avoid favoritism and promote the best interest of the district as a whole, which does concern ethics. So in conclusion, all of this might strike most people as bare platitudes, but I promised you I wasn't going to throw a bunch of law at you. Of course, most board members perceive themselves as being responsible and highly ethical. But as human beings in the heat of the moment, when you're dealing with the divisive or contentious issues, it's easy to forget some of these principles. By nature, human beings are supplied with a good deal of ego, and we like things to go our way. Sometimes we view our ideas as the only one viable, and we therefore block out other opinions and ideas. Responsible and ethical board members will open their eyes and their ears and their minds, and will listen to all ideas and give weight to all opinions, not just their own. They will listen to what their fellow board members have to say, and will weigh all of the facts and opinions provided before making a decision. It's okay to disagree, but it is also important to be reasonable and open to new ideas and opinions. Learning to work with others, even those who disagree with a board member, or with whom the board member disagrees, is vital to the district. Remember, your board is not a one-person show, but it's a team effort. The only way to stay on top of boardsmanship and ethics is to carefully prepare and study in advance, including laws such as the Brown Act and conflict of interest requirements. The second factor would be constantly remind yourself that a board member's role is to serve the best interests of the district and the public as a whole, and not be beholden to any special interest, no matter how praiseworthy it may seem at the time. And most importantly, I believe, is work together as a team. The board does not consist of only one person. Learn to get along and respect one another, not only for our sameness, but also for the differences of the people on your board. And I can tell you, as I said, in observing various boards in action, once you get into a situation where there are different personalities on a board and you get a split, it becomes sheer gridlock from that point forward. So I would say the third factor is the most important, work together as a team. And good luck. Any questions?
Do we have questions on these parts? Okay, I don't see any. So, well, I get the last one. It is, I'm Barb Grunwald with the County Council's office, and We did just a little bit on filling vacancies last year, and our observation was that that seemed to be an area that people wanted a little more detailed guidance on than we were able to provide in the 101 class. So we decided to come back today and deal with that in a little more detail. And congratulations, you've made it down to the last lap, and we'll finish off with this one last thing and hope to get you out of here in good time this evening. The summary of what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes, if you can't remember anything else from my part of this, there's two things I want you to take away. There's two different types of procedures, and on one of them the timelines are very strict, and there's a 60-30 rule under that. So, two types of procedures and a very strict timeline. Those are the important takeaways from this presentation. But before we can get into the details of that, we need to distinguish between the two types of special districts. We've assumed throughout most of this evening that most of you are elected officials, but how many of you are board members of cemetery districts? Are you all elected? Looks like you are. Okay, that's. Oh no, we have some cemetery people back here. Okay, if you're from a cemetery district, your board members are always appointed by the Board of Supervisors. If you're from a community services district, a memorial district, some of the other water districts, you're going to be elected by the voters, and your voters may be landowners depending on what type of district you're, irrigation district, that kind of thing. So we're going to talk about two different types of districts. In this context, if your board members are always appointed, you're an appointed district. If your board members are elected, you're an elected district. So with that background, we'll go on a little bit. If you're an appointed district, you work in a cemetery district or you're on the board of a cemetery district, it's very simple. You have a vacancy on your board, you call the Board of Supervisors, you wait for them to appoint someone. You're done. The only special rule that I want to mention here is some special districts that have appointed boards have one or more board members that are appointed by somebody other than the Board of Supervisors. There is a fail-safe for those districts. If you can't get your appointing authority to do anything and it's been 90 days, you can go to the Board of Supervisors and get them to appoint somebody for you. But that's all I'm going to say for you appointed districts. So you can kind of take a nap for a little while, and I'll wake you up when we get back to things that matter to you. Because now we're getting into the really confusing and complicated part for elected districts. And the reason it's so confusing is that there's two types of vacancies and a completely different procedures for how you go about dealing with those. So if you're on an elected district, you can have one set of procedures where nobody ran for the position, and you have another set of procedures where a position becomes vacant during the term. So first we're going to talk about what you do when nobody runs. This is governed by, the Elections Code. It says what happens when nobody runs. They open the nominations period, it sits there, they do all the things they're supposed to do under the Education Code to publish the availability of the position. Nobody comes in to run. Nobody files nomination papers. At that point, the elections official tells that to the Board of Supervisors, and then the Board of Supervisors, that happens roughly mid-August, and so then the Board of Supervisors has from then until mid-November to scrounge up somebody to appoint that person. So I got one of the handouts that I have in your packet is just a brief description of this process, where you may get a call, you will get a call from the clerk to the Board of Supervisors sometime after mid-August saying, nobody ran, can you give us some names so that we can have somebody for the board to appoint in lieu of election. And so you scrounge up some names and get those people to apply with the Board of Supervisors, and then if they're willing to appoint that person, they can do so, and then they take office. Most of you, you're in districts where the term begins on the first Friday in December, so it makes perfect sense that the Board of Supervisors' deadline for that appointment is the last meeting before, in this case, the Monday before the first Friday in December. So since that usually is running into the Thanksgiving holiday, you're pretty much looking at the middle of November for the last chance for the Board of Supervisors to appoint someone when nobody ran. Well, what if the Board of Supervisors can't find anybody? And so nobody gets appointed by that deadline. What do you do? Well, the statute doesn't say, and different counties do different things. The way we've kind of approached it in Tulare County has been to say, well, it would be helpful to the district if we could try again. So we're going to say that the other set of procedures applies once the term starts and give you a second chance under the midterm vacancy procedures. So once you've checked with the Board of Supervisors after the middle of November, nobody got appointed, then we're going to switch over to the procedures during the term. And if you ever hear people talking about Government Code Section 1780, this is the statute for what you do when you have a vacancy in the middle of the term. And this is the one that has that special 60-30 rule I was talking about. It's a very strict timeline. It's very important. You miss it, you're dead. So, big takeaway from this is when you have a vacancy in the middle of the term, remember the 60-30 rule. What that means is that you have, from the time the clock starts, the district has 60 days to call an election, appoint someone. Then the Board of Supervisors has 30 days to order you to call an election or appoint someone. And if neither of those things happen within 90 days, you have a legal duty to call an election. Now we'll go into some details of that. First, when does the clock start? The statute says when you're notified of the vacancy or the effective date of the vacancy, whichever is later. Now, sometimes you have a board member who's been a great board member, but they're moving. Their spouse got a job out of state or whatever. And so they come to it and they say, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to resign from the board. What's the most easy, best transition, easiest way to handle that? I can make my resignation date anything you want. What's going to work? So you call up your attorney or the elections department or both, and you figure out what the different situations are that would happen depending on when the resignation became effective, and then you can work that through with the board member so that the effective date of the vacancy is one that works for you in your circumstances. But that brings up a little separate side note. How do you resign from a board? What's the official way to do that? There's a generic government code section for this. It says you do it in writing, and for most special district boards, you file it with the Board of Supervisors. If it's another appointing body like a city or something, you might have to file it with them. And again, it lists the effective date, which might be deferred. Well, that brings up another side note. I know this never happens to any of you, but there are other reasons for vacancies. We have this issue on occasion where people seem to have just abandoned the position. That's a little beyond the scope of tonight's discussion, but those are difficult situations. There is a long list in this other government code section, Section 1770, of all of the different events that create a vacancy on a board. And abandoning the position is one of them, but the ones that usually come up are death, resignation, and moving out of the district, or losing residency, of course. And so our discussion tonight is, I'll just tell you that list is there. One of the materials in your packet is a copy of these statutes, and so you can take a look at that and see if that's one of the things you need to talk to your attorney about if you've got a problem with the particular board member. But for tonight, we're assuming that you've got a real vacancy. It's clear you've got a vacancy. The person has died, resigned, moved out of the district, whatever. And so I've given you a little checklist, and this then, besides the checklist in the little form of the PowerPoint here, what you should do first when you have a vacancy and you're an elected district, tell elections. They need to know you have a vacancy. The statute says you have to do it within 15 days, but tell them right away. And to make it easy for you, the materials include a sample letter to elections. It says, here's with their address and everything, and I've included contact information in the materials for people in the elections office. That let them know you've got a vacancy. And because you may end up dealing with the Board of Supervisors under that 60-30 rule we've talked about, please send a copy of the letter to the Board of Supervisors. And that's also in the sample letter. Well, then you've got 60 days from that trigger date to do something. You can either appoint someone or you can call an election. Most of the time you're going to be looking to appoint someone because that's cheaper. And the statute is pretty much silent on how you go about doing that. There's only one procedural requirement other than getting it done within 60 days, is this posting of the vacancy requirement. You have to post notice of a vacancy in 3 or more conspicuous places in the district at least 15 days before you actually appoint someone. So you'd look at your board meeting where you plan to make the appointment, you count back 15 calendar days and make sure you get those notices posted. Otherwise, you have no guidance or restrictions at all on how you go about finding someone, what you do to narrow down the number of candidates if you're lucky enough to have multiple candidates. You just kind of have to figure out how you're going to find the right people and get them appointed. Which brings up, my thing died. Now did I freeze it? What did I do to freeze it? No. Now if I start over, and we can flip through here and get to, okay. Okay, this brings up a little side note under the Brown Act. Remember how Mr. Kuntz said earlier that board members don't count under the personnel exception? Suppose you're lucky enough to have multiple candidates and they have significant variances in their qualifications. Well, if you were just going to sit at the board meeting and decide who to appoint and talk about that, you would have to do that in public, because no matter how embarrassing or anything it is, if it's not listed in the Brown Act as an authorized exception, you can't do it. Well, there's a very handy exception under the Brown Act called the ad hoc committee, composed solely of less than a quorum of the board. So if you have a 5-member board, you can send 2 of those board members off to interview those multiple applicants and come back with a recommendation to the full board. And then those 2 board members who don't have to comply with the Brown Act at all can sit there and talk about their qualifications and why you should recommend one person as opposed to this other complete person who would not be a good board member for all of the reasons that Mr. I discussed. And do all of that private without having to embarrass anybody and come back to the board with a recommendation of one, or if you're lucky enough to have a whole bunch, maybe you've given them the job of recommending 2 or 3 finalists. And then you would have to talk about those people in public. But that's one great use of the ad hoc committee ability under the Brown Act. Well, then what do? You've appointed someone. What should you want to appoint someone? You think you're okay. What do you do to make sure that you don't get into trouble with who you are planning to appoint? Call elections and make sure they're a registered voter in the district. That's incredibly easy to forget, and it's incredibly embarrassing when you find out that the person you actually went to the trouble of appointing, who's been serving for the last 2 months, actually lives on the wrong side of the boundary and isn't a district resident at all, or moved so recently that that their voter registration hasn't caught up with them. It doesn't, and remember, there isn't a rule that they have to be a registered voter for any particular length of time before you appoint them to the board. If you find the right person and you call elections and they say, no, they haven't changed their voter registration since they moved into the district, or we didn't receive it, no, give them the registration thing Send them down to the elections office. Appoint them that night. No problem. Anyway, so let's assume you've got your applicant, you get them appointed to the board within your 60 days. Tell elections so that they know you have an incumbent. Send a copy to the board, please. Great way to help. Okay, you have a 5-member board. You had one vacancy. You split 2 to 2 on who to appoint. You split 2 to 2 on whether to call an election. You couldn't do anything within your 60-day period. What happens? Board of Supervisors has 30 days to appoint somebody. Very strict timeline. Doesn't happen within 30 days. They can't do anything. Tell the elections right away with a copy to the Board of Supervisors. I put a nice sample letter in your materials. It says to the board, it says to the county, we couldn't get anything done in 60 days, please help us. Now the statute says that the Board of Supervisors can appoint someone or call an election, or order you to call an election. I don't think the Board of Supervisors is anywhere anxious to make you spend money on a special election than they would be to spend money on their own special elections. So normally they're going to be asking you then within that 30-day period, do you have any good applicants? Is there somebody that you know that we can appoint? And they'll ask for your help to try to find somebody. And that's the same thing that they did under the elections code where nobody ran, so you can see why it's so easy to get confused about when these strict timelines apply and when they don't. But let's say they can't find anybody either, and so no one gets appointed within that 30-day period. What happens? The statute says you have a legal duty as the district board to call an election. Now, I don't know how many of your boards have done that. I suspect a lot of you have been known to kind of pretend this statutory requirement doesn't exist. If there were that many people, if there were anybody interested enough to run for election, they would have come in and applied to be appointed to start with. It was the reason you couldn't find anybody to appoint is why you don't have anybody there now. If somebody sued you to force you to order to call an election, they would win that lawsuit. I have 2 theories as to why nobody ever bothers to sue you to force you to fulfill that legal duty. Remember some of the earlier speakers talked about a writ of mandate? That would be the lawsuit. They would get a court order that tells you you have to do this. And they would get it because this is a statutory duty. Why doesn't anybody ever bother? Well, number one, if they were that interested, they would have asked to be appointed to the board. And number 2, it's not that urgent a lawsuit. It doesn't take priority over everything else. And it would probably take a year and a half for them to get that final court order, just because litigation takes a little while, even on something that obvious. Well, what's going to happen in a year and a half? You're going to have another general district election, and the position is going to be back on the ballot anyway. So even if somebody wasn't interested enough to want to be on the board, but they were interested enough to want to make you do this, they'd go to their lawyer, and their lawyer would say, why bother? By the time you won the lawsuit, you spent all that money on me, on the attorney's fees, which you wouldn't get back. They're going to be in the next election cycle. So that's my theory. But my job as a lawyer is to tell you what the law is, and the law says you have to call an election. Where you have a semi-technical question, you've appointed someone, how long do they get to be in the position, or how long do they have to be in the position? Sometimes you find someone who says, well, I know you've got a vacancy and I don't want the district to be in a lurch, but I really don't want the position for the whole term. Can I just have it until halfway through the term, and then whoever runs in the election can have it? Yeah, that's actually the way it's supposed to work. If the vacancy occurs, it says in the first half of the term, but what it really means is before the election cycle starts. So it's like 130 days is roughly June of the election year. If you've got somebody who resigns or whatever, so that you have a vacancy in that first year and 9 months of the term, then year and a half, as your December group, then that person that appointee is only entitled to the office until the person elected takes over. So they would only have to be in office till December, provided you can get somebody to run in the next mid-cycle election. So the position goes back on the ballot then for the short term. Now, if the appointee wants to run, they're entitled to, and then they can list themselves as the incumbent. So if you've got somebody who wants to be on the board and you want to give them the advantage of being the incumbent at the midterm election, you can appoint them now and then they can run. And the same, obviously the converse is true. When they're appointed after it's too late to put them on the ballot in the middle of the term, they just hold the office for the remainder of that term. Sometimes things get really bad in a district. You have 5 board members and one of them died and one of them resigned and the other one just got mad and won't come to board meetings, and so you have to figure out a way to make that position vacant. But anyway, let's assume that you actually truly get to the point where you only have 2 out of 5 board members in office and the other 3 positions are all vacant, nobody ran. When you go below a quorum, that's the one time when the timelines, that 60-30 rule doesn't apply. Anybody left, the secretary or the remaining board member, you don't have to have an official action of the whole board, which obviously you can't do if there's no quorum, can let the board of supervisors know, and then the board can appoint enough people to get you back to a quorum. In the case of a 5-member board that still has 2, they could only appoint 1. They can't appoint all 3. But they can at least get you back to a quorum so they can be an official body again. And so they can't order the election too, of course, but again, they want to work with you, and so normally they're going to be appointing too. And it's the same rules for how long the appointee holds office. If it's within the beginning of the term, then that person has to run again halfway through the term. So in summary then, 2 separate procedures that can sound when the board calls you like they're overlapping: the election procedures and the government code procedures. So remember that the 60-30 rule, very important, very strict, applies to those midterm vacancies. And that's the end of my presentation. Ready for questions at this point. We've got one back here, I see. This one says, examples of how a position becomes vacant during the term. Well, if you want to look at your materials, I put a copy of the statute in there. And so we've got section 1770 of the government code has a list of, looks like 11 items. There are different ways to have a vacancy on the board. And probably the most difficult one is the one where it's written in here as ceasing to discharge the duties of his or her office for a period of 3 consecutive months. The sort of passive-aggressive board member who won't resign, but they won't do anything. And the real problem is they have a tendency to show up like every 3rd board meeting. And so, you've never had this happen. Sorry, I'm hearing some laughter out there. So. Or they're ill, and the abandoning their position one that you'll see in here says unless they're sick. So that doesn't, if they're sick, that isn't, they haven't vacated their position. And so you may have to live with that inactive board member for a while until you can get them to recognize that as a good board member, they need to resign and let somebody else take that position. But I would direct your attention to the list in 1770. You can tell from the wording of some of them that some of these provisions have been in the law since the 1800s because they're fairly quaint language in some regard. The second question is, can a board of directors force a resignation upon a director who is not complying with appropriate participation guidelines, code of ethics, or conflict of interest code? Yeah, well, you know how that goes. We're talking here about the kind of uncooperative, bad board member. Our shorthand for it in lawyer language is the rogue board member. where they're just not being a good team player and they're driving everybody crazy? The answer is no, the board cannot do anything to get rid of that person. You're stuck with them for their term. The only people who can get rid of a board member during their term are the public, who can do recall elections, or the grand jury, who can bring a formal accusation against that person in that context that we discussed earlier. And that essentially requires semi-criminal conduct, so the conflict of interest piece might be applicable to that. But the board member who's just driving you crazy, no, probably not. Sorry to say that. Recall elections are an option. If you're an elected, well, if it's elected, this question appears to be, it says elected officers can apply to the board elections or appointment. What can appointed boards do when they need board members and can't have elections? The cemetery district boards and the other ones that have truly appointed boards are just going to have to limp along until the board of supervisors can find someone to appoint. There's no opportunity as a cemetery district board to change to being an elected district. The only true option that a cemetery district board has is suicide, where you ask the board of supervisors to become the board of your district. That's really the only option you have, is the board of supervisors can run a cemetery district, or the appointed board can run a cemetery district. The next question, can the board of supervisors appoint to a joint powers board when an appointed board does not respond to a vacancy in over 90 days? I would have to research that. I think JPA boards are done differently, and that they're a matter of contract, and so it depends on the language of the contract, I think. I don't believe, I do have section 1779 in the material, so you want to take a look at that if it says anything about JPAs, but you might have to talk to your attorney about that one. We may have one board member resigning. I serve on the board. Could my son run for office? Interesting question. Can you have a parent and child both be board members on the same district board? I'm not aware of any nepotism rules about elected officials. So, I don't know. Would the voters vote for that person? I don't know.
Board does it.
So, it'd be a matter of discretion for the appointing authority as to whether that was a good idea or not. Then the second one is, who decides qualifications for the position? That gets back to the discussion we had about there isn't any guidance in the statutes for that. Other than being a registered voter in the district, most of the time that's it. There are some special requirements for some districts. Memorial districts have to have a majority of veterans on their board. So if they have, the elections puts it on the ballot as at-large or veteran positions, and so if one of the veteran positions becomes vacant, the qualification, they would have to be a veteran in addition to being a resident of the district and a registered voter. But otherwise, there are no statutory guidelines. That's totally up to the district as to how you decide the qualification, who's going to be the best appointee for your district. And I think that was all the questions I got, at least if you were putting me in this corner.
Thank you, Barb. We are running just a little bit ahead of schedule. I know that probably some of you would not be disappointed to be let out of school early. I do, however, since there are, I think, 3 of us here still, I wanted to give you the opportunity to ask other questions that you might have that weren't one of the topics that came up this evening. If nobody has such questions, then we will adjourn. But we have one already.
Is there a set?
Can you wait? We've got a microphone.